Okay, good evening. I am Erika de la Garza, the Program Director for the Latin American Initiative for the Baker Institute. And on behalf of the Baker Institute and the Humanities Research Center of Rice University, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. And I'll let Moramay Lopez Alonso present our speaker tonight. But before we do that, I just wanted to mention that this is the beginning of a lecture series so we're going to have 3 more speakers talking on energy, immigration, and art. If you see the invitation, it states that Teresa Franco, who will be discussing art and culture, Mexican art and culture, the event has not happened. We had to reschedule it, and we don't have the date yet. So that one's still coming up. And so I'll let Moramay Lopez Alonso introduce her speaker.
Hello. Miguel Székely was born in Mexico City. He obtained a licentiate degree in economics and a master's degree in public policy from Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM. He also obtained a master's degree in public policy and a PhD in economics from Oxford University in England. He has taught at ITAM and has been a research professor at the Center for Economic Studies at El Colegio de México. He has over 60 publications, including books, journal articles, book compilations, and book chapters. His scholarship reflects his interest and profound knowledge on poverty, inequality, and marginalization in Mexico and Latin America. He has been a keynote speaker in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Panama, Uruguay, El Salvador, Spain, the United States, England, France, Morocco, Norway, Sweden, and Mexico. He has received numerous awards, such as Innova, a distinction granted by the Mexican presidency for his project on poverty estimation, the Nancy Ruggles Award for Research on Income and Wealth, 2 prizes from the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Professional Merit Award granted by ITAM to its outstanding alumni. Dr. Székely is a member of the Mexican National Researcher System. He has been an advisor and collaborator with the Inter-American Development Bank, with the World Bank, and several organizations with the United Nations, such as the ECLAC, the Economic Cooperation for Latin America, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the Organization for Development Promotion. He has also been vice president of the Territorial Committee for Development Policies with the OECD. Prior to being head of the Secretariat of Middle Education, he has also directed the Regional Development Unit at the Mexican Presidency's office, and he has been Undersecretary for Planning and Evaluation at the Secretariat for Social Development. So it is a great pleasure to have Dr. Székely here.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everybody. And thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. What I thought could be of interest for you tonight was to talk about a little bit about poverty and education in Mexico, 2 very big challenges that are actually very related. So, first of all, it's not working, I think. Here it is. No. No? Well, while the slide comes on, so here it is. Okay. So first I will be talking a little bit about historical trends in poverty and inequality, long-term trends. Then a little bit, very briefly, about the link between productivity and poverty, and then poverty and education, and finally, some of the policies that have been introduced during this administration with regards to the link between education and productivity and therefore poverty. So first of all, in this first slide, you can see in the red line, you will find the evolution of what we call moderate poverty in Mexico between the years of 1950 and 2006. These numbers are produced through a methodology, the official methodology for poverty measurement in Mexico, that was introduced in the year 2003. And it's a methodology suggested by 7 academics, independent academics, who took 1 year to suggest an official definition of poverty. There are 3 different definitions. One is moderate poverty, which is basically the income per capita that you would require in Mexico to cover the basic needs in food, housing, clothing, health, and education. And there's another measure there of food poverty, which is only the amount of money you need for every person to cover the very basic needs in terms of caloric intake. And what's interesting in this graph is that between 1950 and the beginning of the 80s, which are the years of the highest economic growth rates in Mexico historically, we find a very drastic reduction in moderate poverty from about 88% of the population to about half of the population in the course of 30-something years. And when you look at food poverty, the story is similar until the beginning of the 1970s. But then between 1970 and the year 1996, you basically see no change in food poverty and extreme poverty. But moderate poverty did decline until 1984, which is one of the dates in the horizontal axis are for the years where a household survey, income and expenditure survey, is available in Mexico. And the reason the decline in moderate poverty stops in 1984 is because 1982 is the year of the first big economic crisis in this second half of the 20th century. So really 1984 is reflecting the reduction in income, the big shock that the economy experienced in 1982. Then between 1984 and 1994, 10 years, where there was actually some growth of GDP, what's interesting is that poverty doesn't decline as in the first half of the graph. So moderate poverty stays about half of the population, while food poverty varies between 22.5 and 21.1%. But then in 1996, there's a big jump because of the tequila crisis in that year. And there's an increase from 55.6 to almost 70% of the population. This was the rate of poverty observed around 30 years before 1996. And also a big jump in food poverty. But from 1996 to the year 2006, 10 years, where GDP started to grow again, the economy was much more stable. There was a very dramatic reduction in poverty again, from about 70% to 42.6% for moderate poverty between 1996 and 2006, and in food poverty from 37% to 13.8%. One aspect that is important to note about this graph is that if you look along Latin America, Mexico is one of the very few countries where you will find such a reduction in poverty in this kind of time period of 10 years. The only other country with something similar is Chile. But in Mexico, of course, having this started in 1996, the year of the peak of the crisis, part of the reduction is simply going back to the rates observed before the crisis. If you compare 1994 with 2002, you will find basically no change between those 2 years. So part of the decline is just to compensate for the increase during the crisis. But that's a long-term view of poverty in Mexico. If you look at the exact numbers, what you will find, and I would like you to focus on the second box and the second table at your right, you will see that between 1950 and 1984, the year where poverty stopped declining, moderate poverty, if you look at the right, the last column to your right, there were almost 24 million poor in 1950, and due to population growth, although the proportion of poor was much lower in 1984, the absolute number of poor was higher, about 40 million. But then again, if you look at the period between 1996 and 2006, we find one of the only periods where actually the proportion of poor declined, and at the same time, the absolute number of poor declined. In 1996, there were 66.2 million in moderate poverty, and in 2006, the number is 46 million. That is a reduction of 20 million poor. And when you look at food poverty, the decline is not as dramatic, but still you find a change, of about 20 million also from 35.3 million to almost 15 million. So the last 10 years in Mexico have been years of considerable changes in poverty, reductions in poverty, according to these figures. And but even so, if you look at the 2006 numbers, still a country like Mexico with 46 million moderate poor, or 42% of its population in moderate poverty, is way above what you would expect given the size of the economy and the GDP per capita of a country like Mexico. And the reason why there is still this discrepancy between GDP and poverty is because Mexico is still a very, very unequal country. In this graph you see right now, the line is the evolution of an inequality index, a Gini inequality index. And in the case of inequality, there was an important increase in inequality between 1950 and 1958. And then between 1958 and again 1984, there is a considerable decline in inequality. But then again, in 1984, inequality increased, with only the exception of 1 year. Inequality increases all the way to 1998, and according to the statistics available, inequality declines between 1998 and 2006, but still the level of inequality in Mexico in this year, in 2006, is way beyond the inequality observed in other countries with a similar level of development. If we characterize a population in three big groups of poor, rich, and middle class, you see a similar picture than the evolution of inequality. Here, the way the rich are defined are the top decile, the richest 10% of the population in 1984. The income of that, the lowest income in that decile is taken as an income to define the rich. So whatever we find between moderate poverty and the rich, we call middle class. And between 1950 and 1984, the main characteristic of the Mexican economy in terms of social indicators was the expansion of the middle class, a drastic reduction in poverty and an expansion of the middle class for two reasons. For basically one reason, and it's a reduction of poverty. The number of rich, or the proportion of rich in the population, also expanded a little bit. Between 1984 and 1998 and 1996, the numbers are fairly stable. But then with the crisis, the number of poor, the proportion of poor increased, the number of rich declined, and the middle class declined. But from then on, again, there is an important expansion of the middle class. Basically, if you look at the year 2002 to the same levels before the crisis, and between 2002 and 2006, the expansion of the middle class still continues. But still then, if you look at the Mexican economy, the main aggregates, the number of poor and the level of inequality are much higher than what you would expect given the level of development. And this table here with some very basic correlations show what the poverty and inequality trends have been related to. The first column has just a standard straightforward correlation between the poverty index and GDP per capita, and what we find is that there is a very strong negative relationship between poverty, the three definitions of poverty, and GDP. That is what you would expect, that when GDP increases, poverty declines, and vice versa. And historically, at least with the numbers we have between 1950 and 2006, there is this very strong correlation. There is also a negative correlation between poverty and inequality. This means that when inequality increases, poverty tends to there is a big correlation between inequality and GDP, also a negative correlation, which means that when there is growth in GDP per capita, inequality tends to decline. The second column has a correlation between poverty and inequality and inflation. And what we find is that when inflation increases, poverty and inequality tend to increase, and vice versa. Also a strong relationship, not as strong as with GDP. And the third column has the correlation between inequality and poverty, and what you would expect is that when inequality increases, poverty also tends to increase, and the relationship is quite strong. So that is the evolution in very general terms of poverty and inequality and some very general aggregates in the economy. And perhaps the main conclusion is that even though poverty and inequality have declined in the past 10 years, for which we have information, still the level of those two indicators is way above the level that a country of Mexico should have. And looking at the evolution, this long-term evolution, when we look at the relationship between poverty and growth, it's almost a tautology to say that poverty and growth are negatively related. Generally, what you would expect is that when there are more resources in the economy, poverty should be lower. And depending on the level of inequality, it will be lower or higher. But in general, you would expect that relationship. But if the question is to reduce poverty, we should increase growth, well, it's almost the same as saying nothing, because to increase growth, you need a specific set of policies, and those policies are not precisely very clear. What are the policies you need to increase the growth rate of an economy? If we knew, perhaps countries like Mexico would be growing faster. So one way to go about in the relationship, what is behind this general relationship between poverty and growth, is to look at the elements of growth, or which parts of growth are more related to poverty. And one way of doing this, just in a very general approximation, is to look at the components of GDP and try to determine which of these components are more related to poverty. And the numbers I will show in this graph tell you a little bit about this. If we decompose GDP in four components, which are just the very basic disaggregation of taxes, operational superavit, wage bill, and subsidies, we find that in general GDP is more highly correlated with wages than any other variable. And the same happens with poverty. When you look at poverty and the elements of GDP that determine that aggregate up to GDP, what we find is that the part of GDP to which poverty is much more tightly correlated is actually with wages. So if we try to look a little bit more about the relationship between wages and poverty, there are two determinants of wages. One is the wage rate, and the other is the level of employment. And what we find disaggregating these numbers and looking at correlations is that of those two elements of the wage bill, which is the level of employment and the wage rate, poverty is much more highly correlated with the wage rate than to the number of people employed in the economy. And the reason is that in Mexico, employment rates are very high, unemployment rates are very low, lower than in the US, for example. And the reason why they're very low is because for these kinds of measurements of employment and unemployment, we take the whole economy, that is formal and informal sectors. And since very few Mexicans can actually afford to be unemployed, most people are employed in either of those sectors. And that is why the level of employment in Mexico does not vary substantially over the years or over the months. What you find is that the wage rate does change. Actually, and especially in this period between 1950 and 2006, what changes more is wages rather than the number of people employed. And actually, if you look at the correlation between poverty and the wage level, the wage rate, the correlation is almost perfect, 0.97. That is, when the wage level increases by 1%, normally the correlation there is wrong in the sign. It's minus 0.97 and minus 0.13. When the wage rate increases by 1%, usually poverty declines almost also by 1% historically. And when you look at the relationship between poverty and the wage, the number of people employed, you find again, a negative correlation. When more people are employed, there is less poverty, but the relationship is much weaker than with wage levels. And then if we move along and we look at the determinants of the wage level, what we find again with these kind of data is that what determines wage levels in Mexico in the long run, not surprisingly, it is the productivity rate, much more than minimum wages or real exchange rates or even inflation. It's the productivity of human resources what determines the wage levels in the long run. Wage levels are very highly correlated with poverty. So if we look at the long-term relationship between growth and poverty, what we find is really that behind average growth rates we have changes in the wage bill, which reflects mainly changes in real wages, and real wages are changed basically by changes in labor productivity over the years. So from this kind of very general analysis, what we could conclude is that what really changes poverty over time is labor productivity in Mexico over the years. And this is not surprising if you look at a very, very simple framework. If you look at the income of each person, the income of each person is determined by the quantity of assets, income-earning assets or capabilities, physical capital, human capital, or social capital, and the price paid for that kind of capital in the market. The number of units, for example, of human capital put to work in the labor market multiplied by the wage rate for that specific human capital determines the wage of an individual employed in the labor market. So in the end, it's also, again, almost a tautology to say that poverty and growth are related. And when you go a little bit forward and you look at what's behind growth and we can see that productivity is the main factor. Again, I mean, it's a little bit more than just saying growth, but again, how to increase productivity is not a totally answered question in terms of public policy. But one of the things that is not very controversial is that productivity, at least in terms of human resources, is determined by the level of education, formal education. And although there is not a perfect relationship between education and productivity, the relationship is pretty strong, and there are many studies showing this. So in general, we would expect that if we increase the level of education in Mexico, the level of education of the population, this will, if the education is education that increases productivity in the labor market, for example, you would expect that people would have access to higher wages, and that would have as consequence higher incomes and lower poverty rates. So if we go into what's happening to education, what we find is that, again, looking at the long-term perspective, education has increased in Mexico. In 1960, the average years of education of the working population was of 2.6 years, 1960. And in the year 2007, it has increased to 8.3 years of education, a very big increase. But there are several problems. The first problem is that what's stopping Mexico, and if you look at the previous graph, if you look at, for example, 1990 and or the year 2000 and a little bit before 2000 and 2007, the level of education is increasing, but it is increasing much less than in many other countries, and I'll show some evidence on that. And the part of the education system where we're having the greatest bottleneck in terms of access to education to increase productivity is what we call in Mexico middle education, or in the US what would be the equivalent to high school. And this graph shows one of the big problems. If the first bar to your left shows the coverage of primary education, the first year of primary education, and Mexico is a country where practically 100% of the children that are of an age that is required to go to primary education, it's almost 100%. Of course, there are some children that don't go to school, but the problem in Mexico is not the coverage or the supply of education for that age group. If you look actually from the first to the sixth year of primary, it's almost 100% in all cases. Of course, there's a big challenge in terms of quality and many other factors, but the supply is there in general for a very large majority of the population. In fact, when we go to the second part of the education system, what we call secondary education, from first to third, or what would be seventh to ninth in the US, the coverage is still very high. In the third year of secondary, we have 86.5% of the children in that age group going to school, covered by the education system. But the problem is right in the next step, right after what we call secondary, what would be the equivalent of high school in the US or middle education in Mexico. The sector of the education system where we lose the largest number of people is actually in high school. The absorption rate between third of secondary and first of high school is actually quite high, but the problem is the dropout rates between first and second and third. If you compare how many children leave third year of secondary and how many finish, it's actually about half of those that were still there in third of secondary. You will find them still there in the third year of high school. And then the next step to the university, there is another important decline. But the part of the education sector where we lose the largest number of people is actually high school or middle education. And all the variables related to middle education in Mexico or high school are the worst in the education system. For example, the dropout rates are much higher than anywhere else. The overall efficiency of the system is lower than anywhere else. And the coverage, right today in the year 2007, the Mexican economic education system covers not even 60% of those in the age group for attending high school. And that means that 42% of those people are not going to school, do not have a chance to continue their education. And the reasons for dropping out are quite dramatic. This information comes from the last economic census, where there is a question asking people why they dropped out of school, and especially those that dropped out from high school. When you ask this question among those that dropped out at 15 years of age, the number one answer is not actually an economic reason, is that these people say they don't want to go to school, or school is not relevant for them. It's really a problem of quality of the education system. Going to school doesn't give them any advantage. They don't perceive any benefit of going to school. The numbers change a little bit when you ask at age 16, 17, but even at age 17, when they should be in the second year of high school, the number one reason for not going to school is that these people don't want to go to school, they don't think it's relevant, they don't think it's important. And the second reason, which is at this age is almost the same in importance, is economic reasons, that is that they don't have money to go to school. And when you ask at age 18 or 19, things balance out, and at age 19, the main reason is economic, that people don't have the economic resources to go to school. But still, having as the main reason that the problem is not money, but that they don't want to go to school, they don't think it's important, is very dramatic. And of course, there is a very strong relationship between poverty and school attendance. In this graph, what we plot is the proportion of people that are in the age group for attending high school, but that don't go to school. The first number is for the first decile, the poorest 10% of the population. If you ask those that dropped out, how many dropped out from school in high school in the first decile among the poorest 10% of the population, only 13.5% actually go to high school. And if you look at the other extreme of the graph, when you ask this question among the richest 10%, practically all the people in that age group go to school. And there's a linear relationship between poverty, in this case, income level, and school attendance in high school. And those results are not very surprising when you look at the value added of middle education or high school in Mexico. And actually, these numbers that you see right now on the screen are an underrepresentation of the problem. They're just simple averages for the population. What you have here is the average wage of people with different education levels. It's just the plain average among those employed in the labor market, and that where you can identify the education level. people in Mexico employed in the labor market and that have less than primary education in the year 2006 have an average monthly wage of 2,250 pesos. That is around $200, $210 a month when people have less than primary education. Again, these are plain averages. When people have primary education, in general, they earn about 30% more, 2,952 pesos in average. That is around $280. And the difference between primary and secondary is not that large. From average wages increase about 23%. And also the difference between secondary and middle education is not that large, around 35%. The big jump comes after middle education, when people have some higher education, professional degree. And what these numbers reflect, and what happens in reality, there's some other evidence pointing out to this, is that when people know that they won't be able to access higher education to get a university degree, the value added of going to high school is not very evident, and investing 3 years in school rather than in the labor market earning a wage, even though that wage is not as high as could be around $350. Perhaps it's not worth sacrificing those 3 years and going to school if you get an education that will not really increase your income earning power in the future. What will really make a difference is a professional degree. So many people actually, when they know they won't get to where there's much greater value added, they don't keep on investing in education. And that is one of the reasons why people say, I don't go to school because it's not relevant. It doesn't give me anything. And these numbers give you some indication of that. But again, this is an underrepresentation because it just takes average wages. If you run a regression controlling for personal and socioeconomic variables, you will find that the return to education, the difference between secondary and middle education is not very significant, but the big difference, again, is with higher education. And the main problem that the main implication is that now when countries like Mexico are inserted into the world markets and in a global economy, the problem is not only how the evolution of variables like education levels is. It's not only a matter of improving with respect to the past, but improving with respect to potential competitors in the market. And of course, some of the countries that compete with Mexico in world markets are the East Asian countries like Korea. And what you find in Korea, when you look, for example, at what is happening to high school, to middle education, it's the opposite than in Mexico. Countries like Korea and the other East Asian countries actually invested very large amounts of public money in expanding high school or middle education at a time where they were going through a demographic transition, where they were having more people in ages of attending high school. If you look, these are numbers from the last OECD report. If you look at, for example, people in Korea that today are between 45 and 54 years of age, that is, they were going through the education system about 30 years ago, around 60% of them, a little bit less, 57% of them actually attended high school. But if you look at the cohort 20 years later, that is people going to school around 10 years ago in the education system at the age of going through high school 10 years ago, there was a very big jump. Today, those cohorts that were going to school 10 years ago have almost 100% coverage in high school or middle education. In countries like the US and Canada, the changes are not that large because the coverage rate or the proportion of the population in the age of going to high school that actually went to high school were already very large 30 years ago. The OECD average did go up from around 64 to almost 80% in 20 years. And if you look at other countries that are potentially competing with Mexico in the world markets like Greece, Ireland, even Italy, or countries like Turkey, Brazil, Chile, which are countries that have some similar characteristics with Mexico and are competing with Mexico in world markets, in all cases, there was an increase in the proportion of people going to high school at the age that corresponds to high school. But when you look at Mexico, even though in the last 40 years there has been an improvement, when you compare it to what's happening in other countries of the world, Mexico is lagging considerably with respect to these potential competitors. So apart from the fact that poverty and education are tightly linked because education determines productivity, when you look at the broader picture, the problem is not only that poverty in Mexico is still higher than what it should be given the level of development, but the prospects for the future are not very positive when you look at what's happening in the rest of the world, where countries that have had very high growth rates like Ireland or like Chile or the East Asian or even Turkey, what those countries are doing, one of the things they're doing is precisely investing in middle education. And one of the additional problems in Mexico, it's not only that in the past the coverage rates of high school have been growing at a lower rate than in other countries, but that we're at a phase of the demographic transition where expanding coverage will be even more difficult than in the past. Mexico, as in many other Latin American countries, were countries basically of the majority of the population were children below 15 years of age. And for many, many decades, what the education system did was expand primary and secondary school precisely to provide education services for the vast majority of children or people lower than 15 years of age. But what the East Asian countries did when they were going through the similar stage was that when the demographic structure shifted precisely to the age group of 15 to 20, they started closing primary and secondary schools and opening high schools to expand the supply of the service and to be able to have more people in the education system. But what we didn't do that in Mexico and in many other Latin American countries. And in the next years, even to increase the coverage between 58% and 68%, which has been set as the goal for this administration, we would have to expand the supply of high school by 120,000 places a year, just to get to 68%, which is still, if you look at this graph again, if we were at 68%, we would be still below all countries in this graph, with the exception of Italy, Turkey, and Brazil, even if we get to 68%. But so this expanding the system now is much more difficult than having done that 10 years ago or more. And even with a modest goal like this, it would require a very big effort to be able to considerably increase the coverage of higher education and therefore increase the average number of years of education of the working population. So there are 8 big areas where this administration is focusing in middle education, and I will just mention them very briefly. But they are 8 strategic areas where, if progress is made, we think that we will be able, perhaps not to compensate for all those years where we didn't expand the system, but at least we will be able to align the high school sector or middle education sector in Mexico for the future. The first is evaluation. As many other examples I will give, if you look at what happens in the Mexican education system, you will find that in basic education, that is primary and secondary, there are several policies that still have to be improved, but there are several public policies that have been in place for many years. The same happens for higher education, professional degrees. But when you look at middle education, there's a total absence of policies. And one example is evaluation. We don't have national exams. We don't have we didn't have in the past any instruments for evaluating the quality of the system. And one of the things we are doing now since the beginning of this administration is to introduce evaluation across the system. And the most visible example is that we are introducing a national test that is already in place for basic education, which is called the Prueba Enlace. That is a test applied to all students to look at the development of different capacities. And in April 2008, the first Enlace test will be applied for high school. The second is investing in supply. For the first time, there are some funds to invest in infrastructure and to expand supply, but this is still a very big challenge given that we have to include more than 120,000 students, additional students per year between now and 2012. The third, there were no instruments for giving access to the poor, for equalizing access to education. We're starting now with some scholarships targeted to the poor to give them access to the education system. It's an ongoing effort that started with the Oportunidades program that was extended to middle education, and now several other programs are in place. And there's the fourth element is very important, is linking high school to the economic sectors, because what we found is that there's actually a divorce between the needs of the economic sector and what school provides, or the tools that schools are giving to students going to the labor market. So there are several initiatives to try to link economic activity to the contents of education in high school. In high school in Mexico, we include schools that are similar to what you have in the U.S. That there are schools that have more to do with linking people to the labor market rather than going for a university degree. Also, another very important element is that middle education is precisely in the middle between basic education and higher education. And for many years, the three systems have evolved basically as totally independent sectors. And the role of middle education is to try to have links with both, so that you can really look at this as a system rather than three separate policies. The sixth strategy is to introduce for the first time also teacher training and development. There were no policies for this either. The seventh, which is actually quite interesting, is school leadership or school principals. One of the main actors in the system, in any education system, and Mexico is not the exception, is the role that principals play in school. And in Mexico, in middle education, basically they were political appointments. The governor of the state or the union or many other actors determined who the principal of each school was. And 4 months ago, we introduced a different scheme where we're opening all the positions for school principal in middle education, the federal part of the system, to competition. So we open a competition, and any teacher, any member of the school system can apply, and there's an exam. They have to present a program for leading the school and several other factors. So now we're starting out of in the federal system. We have already 2 rounds of school principals that have been elected by competition rather than being a political appointment, and this is starting to have some important effects. And finally, given the disorganization and dispersion of the middle education system in Mexico, we're starting a reform for creating a national system. In Mexico, when you look at basic education, there is a single system wide across the country. When you look at higher education, although there are many universities in different states, but there is a sector of higher education, there are institutions for higher education, and again, for middle education, there's nothing. So we're starting the creation of the national middle education system, where the main challenge is to have some organization into the system. For example, right now, if you start in one school, you can spend 2 years in one school in middle education, and if you want to go to another school, you have to start all over again. It's like if you were in totally independent systems. So one of the main elements of the reform is creating a national system where, regardless of where you study and what you study, you can go and you can transfer to other schools in other areas or in other states. So these are this is just to give you just a very general idea of what is being done. But the main message, I think, or the main message I would want to leave with you is that if we want to reduce poverty and inequality in Mexico, definitely we have to improve education, but it's not education in general. The main bottleneck is middle education in Mexico, and for the first time for many decades, this is the priority in terms of school policy for an administration. And we think that we have to, this is the place where we have to invest, and if we don't do something very dramatic here, Mexico will lag considerably in many other areas in the following years. But on the contrary, if we do something here, if we are able to create this national system and address the challenges of this bottleneck of the education system, this will imply that Mexico can make a big jump in terms of economic development in the future decades. So thank you very much, and I think we have a little time if you want to have any question or comment.
I like the question. My impression in Mexico is that most of the people who go to university come out of the private school system. They come from preparatorias that are private, and also that there's a constraint in the number of people which can go into university. There's a shortage of places in university. Isn't there a bottleneck there that essentially the private sector is feeding the universities?
Yeah, there is, but when you compare it to this sector, this sector is even worse. Actually, one of the reasons why the middle education sector is a bottleneck right now is because with these high coverage rates of primary and secondary, much more people can go into middle education. If you look at the excess demand for middle education in Mexico, the infrastructure is much more limited than in higher education, even though in higher education there is also shortage of supply of the service. And what you say is true. If you look at the combination of public-private services, if you look at primary education or basic education all the way to secondary, you'll find that around 80% is public and 20% is private. When you go to middle education, it's about the same, 80-20. But when you go to higher education, a very large proportion is private. And also you find that most people from private schools that want to go to the university go either to the public or to the private. But even so, the problem is much larger in middle education. Of course, if you do something in middle education and you're successful, the problem in higher education will be even worse. And but the advantage now is that I think at least in the national education program we have for this administration, that is acknowledged from the beginning. And we know that if more people have the chance of going to high school, we now have to start fixing also what we do in higher education, because there will be a consequence over there also. But that is a desirable problem to face. Yes.
You use the term moderate poverty. Could you define that in terms of annual wage?
Yes, among the three levels, the moderate poverty includes a larger number of goods. It's education, health, food, housing, clothing, and transport. Those three elements, and that is an income of about $70 a month per person in each household. $70 per person. Sorry, no. No, sorry, that's food poverty is $70 per person a month. Moderate poverty is 90, and it's 7,500 pesos per family of five. That is 1,250, around $130 per person per month. That's moderate poverty. A family of five with $700 a month. So that per month, that is so yearly. That would be 8,400 a year. Yes.
I'm just having like free association going on in my brain. I don't know where to begin. But could there be a way that the Mexican government could somehow create some type of financial incentive for a student that completes a certain level of education so that it's like, oh wow, if I can get this far, maybe I might have some money to begin, you know, let's say the university level.
Yes, actually, there is an instrument already in place. It has been there for 2.5 years in the Oportunidades program. The Oportunidades program is a program that gives a monthly allowance, a cash allowance, to poor families to invest in education, health, and nutrition. And so families get a scholarship. They get an economic incentive to send their children to health clinics, and the mother in the household has to go every month to courses to improve nutrition practices and things like that. And that is a program that has been there already for 10 years. It covers around 20% of the Mexican population. And this program for children in third year of what we call secondary has a program, a policy instrument where when children go into third year, we open a bank account, and if they attend to school every year between third year of secondary and third year of high school, they accumulate some savings. And when they graduate from high school, they have access to the money, and they can use the money, for example, to go to higher education, or they can use it also, for example, to start a business. It's not much money, but it gives them access, for example, to go and present the exam to go to a university. We are in the third generation that is already graduating with the fund. The next year we will have the first generation that accumulated this incentive from third year of secondary, and it's been evaluated. And right now, since people have only had this fund have been accumulating for 1 or 2 years, the amount of money is not much. But we expect that next year, when actually the class graduating in 2008, in July 2008, will be the first to leave with the fund complete, and we will be able to know for the first time if that makes a difference or not. And we're planning on doing that the same for other scholarship programs outside of Oportunidades. That's one first initiative. But I think that is one of the main policy instruments that can really improve the chances of many people of going to the university or to middle education.
Hi, I was wondering if you have an idea of how much in financial resources is being devoted specifically to expand the middle school education.
Yes, and actually, if you look at the whole education sector, it is the sector of the government that has the largest budget. It's a huge, huge budget. And about 8% of that budget goes to middle education, even though the proportion of students in middle education is much higher. That is the average expenditure per student is much lower in middle education than in primary, secondary, or higher education. But this is a case where the amount of money is not necessarily the solution. For example, when you look at primary education, where we have the largest union in Latin America with more than 1 million teachers, just putting more money into the system doesn't necessarily guarantee greater quality. So one of the reasons we're trying to define strategic areas for investing in education is because it's not only a matter of spending more, but spending better. And actually this year, this is the first year for many years where in Congress, where they're defining the budget right now, they are putting attention to this part of the education system. But the idea is not just to throw more money into the system, but to invest in these 8 policies, and that is what we're working on with Congress right now. So we hope that next year we will have a better perspective. Yes.
A lot of countries have a problem having too many college graduates that are not employable. Is Mexico thinking about technical education as a substitute?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's a very good point, and we have that problem in Mexico also. And one interesting aspect of what we call middle education is that it includes standard education to go to the university, but also the technical education system. And for example, the way we're designing the scholarship programs right now, if you go to a technical school, the scholarship is higher than if you go to a standard school. And we're doing the same. The technical education system is separated between middle and higher education, both concentrated in technical. And we're trying to give incentives so that people find it more attractive to go there, because we don't require, in many areas, we don't require that many college graduates, but what we would call technicians. And there's one figure that illustrates this very well. In most developed countries, there are 3 nurses per doctor. In Mexico, we have 3 doctors per nurse. And that is because education is not only a matter of giving access to a better income, but it is a part of the socioeconomic status. In Mexico, still, for many people, the measure of socioeconomic status is that their children have a professional degree. So it's also a cultural issue that is not very easy to address. But that's definitely the future. And there is a total lack of linkage between where people want to go, what people want to study, and what the economic sectors require. And it's mainly because of cultural factors, and that is something that you can't change from night to day just like that. But the problem has to be addressed, and these kinds of instruments, like giving higher scholarships in the kind of education, is just a way to start.
We can take one more question.
Does Mexico have the resources to do what you're describing, number one, and is there support amongst both political parties in Mexico for this, or is this one party versus the other, or is there popular support overall?
Yeah, actually, when you look at the size of the education sector, and if you quantify how much money you need to really start reform in middle education, the money is not a problem. It's, for example, what we're spending on basic education. If you look at the size of that expenditure, what you would need to really revolutionize middle education is around 1% of that budget to really have a huge impact in middle education. So it's not really a problem of the amount of money. I mean, the country is definitely able to finance that investment. It's really a matter of your second question of political will. But I think that one big advantage right now is that for the first time, at least people know there's a problem. Congressmen know that this is a problem, and right now, in the discussion of the budget, for the first time, this is an issue. Actually, one of the reasons why this has been the forgotten part of the education sector is because the interest groups behind this sector are very dispersed. And if you look at basic education, we have the union, and the union usually have congressmen, have senators, have many ways of influencing political decisions, such as the budget. And so there has always been a very strong interest group assuring that money flows to that part of the education sector. And the other extreme, in higher education, universities are also very powerful, and they can make a lot of noise. So there's also a very powerful interest group in higher education that has always assured their share of the budget. But since middle education has been a very local issue, there weren't any political forces behind. For the first time, more than having a political force behind this because there's an interest, like in the union or universities, it's that it's really being acknowledged as a problem. And what, for example, state governors are facing every year is that every year they have more people demanding the service, and the infrastructure is simply not there. So I think this is for the first time a year 2008 where we will have political will to actually invest in this sector. I think we will see that in the following weeks, actually, when the budget is approved, and we can have perhaps a.
I wanted the young man over there.
No, it's that question actually. It's fine. Thank you.
Okay, but you had a question?
Yes, are these policies applied across Mexico or just focus on Mexico City or the big cities?
Well, one of the worst nightmares of middle education in Mexico is that you have 25 different systems. In basic education, in primary and secondary, there is one national system, and that's it. And here you have a federal system, which is about 1/3 of the total. You have state systems, which are about 15%. You have a combination of state and federal, which is about 1/3 of the system. You have university systems, which are autonomous, and you have the private sector also. And within each of those, there are different variations. So the only space where you can really introduce policies at the federal level is about 1/3 of the total. But there is a lot of influence of what we do in the federal in the rest, but it is not automatic. It's something that, again, it's a matter of political agreements and having, for example, in the case of the universities, which are autonomous, there has to be an agreement to apply, for example, some of these policies. But in the case of scholarships, for example, we're already doing it in investment in infrastructure. So I think, given that there is conscience now that people know that this is a big problem and that something has to be done about it, I think that that very big problem of dispersion of the system, although it will still be there, for the first time it is starting to move a little bit along the same lines. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to be here.